The talk I'm about to give is essentially a slight reworking of a talk that I gave this past March at the International Cologne Liturgical Conference in Herzogenrath, Germany. So I think it's out there on YouTube, so if you've already heard the talk, you're excused. And I'm here to speak on one of my very favorite topics, namely the sacred liturgy. At the time that I delivered my talk in Germany, I prefaced my remark with this statement, that I am firmly of the mind that if we do not get the sacred liturgy right, we will continue to experience many other problems in our common ecclesial life, our life in the church. I speak to you today not as a scholar, and I say that right out at the outset. I do not speak today as a scholar, but as a pastor of the church. My postgraduate work was in canon law, not the sacred liturgy. Although I am not a liturgical scholar, I have studied the current state of affairs in the church regarding the sacred liturgy, and I have immersed myself in an appreciation of the liturgical reform that took place before, but especially after, the Second Vatican Council. I lived and experienced that reform, as all of you did. Well, most of you. Some of you are very young. When we talk about Vatican II, you realize that's history for these young people. You know, it's sort of like, you know, my folks would talk about World War II. You know, that's like history. This is history for them, ancient. So now as a bishop of the church, I have my own perspective concerning from where we have come and to where we still need to go. I am going to frame my presentation today in terms of my own personal experience of the reform of the sacred liturgy that took place here in the United States in the wake of Vatican II. In many ways, I think as personal as Father Theo's talk was, you know, I'm going to draw on my own experience. And I know this may sound perhaps a little too personal to some and perhaps not universal enough. But my experience was the experience of many, if not most, of the people over these years. And it's going to be, I'm going to tell you right now, so many of you in this room will resonate with the experience that I had. Following an explanation of my own experience, I will share some perceptions of what is happening here in North America regarding the ongoing liturgical renewal in the light of the tradition of the Roman liturgy. We need to understand the history of what happened before we can fully appreciate what is happening now regarding a rediscovery of tradition in the sacred liturgy. And I think Bishop Vaja's talk last night gave us some real insight into some of the philosophical underpinnings of what we saw happen. Mine is, as I say, not going to be so scholarly, but more experiential. Before launching into the heart of my presentation, I wish to make an important point, however. I don't think it comes as a surprise to anyone in this room that I have gained a reputation for being devoted to a more traditional expression of the sacred liturgy, not just in the extraordinary form, but in the ordinary form as well. This does not come from a place of sentimentality or a nostalgia for the past. I am a complete product of the Second Vatican Council, never having consciously experienced the traditional liturgy as a young person. I am the first bishop in the United States, by the way, born in the year 1960 or later. So what I have to say comes from my own deepening appreciation for our liturgical tradition, gained mainly from my years as a university student and forward from that time. But I want to be clear about this. This isn't, I'm not nostalgically yearning for something. This is a whole discovery for me, as it has been for so many of you, especially the younger. I've decided to begin my experience, or my talk, with an experience that I had as a young secondary high school student in about the year, I think it was in 1977, 1978, when I was, I think, 17 years old. I was attending a Catholic school at the time, and we were having a day of recollection at, actually it was at UNLV. This was in Las Vegas. So we had we went to the Campus Ministry Center at the university there for a day of recollection. And when it came time for Mass, the priest gathered us all around a coffee table, seated in a circle. And he proceeded with celebrating the Mass seated at the table with us. The bread for the Eucharist was leavened and placed in a simple basket enfolded in a napkin. The chalice was, of course, you would guess, made of pottery. It was a very casual experience, with a great emphasis placed on the meal dimension of the Holy Eucharist. And at the time, it was considered to be a very relevant way of celebrating the Mass that would appeal to young people. It left me very much unimpressed. I'd almost completely forgotten about this experience until the year 2008. I was at the time learning to celebrate the extraordinary form of the Roman liturgy. Pope Benedict XVI had issued Summorum Pontificum, and as a bishop of the Church, I thought it was my duty to learn how to celebrate the traditional Latin Mass. I was so deeply impressed by the solemnity, the beauty, and the reverence of the traditional Mass. And I wondered, and this was like one of those light bulb moments for me. Wow. Okay. Who arranged for the special effects? Wow, that was good. Oh. We're back in the dark ages. No. But I was so deeply impressed by it, and this was kind of like one of those aha moments. And I wondered, how could we have gone so quickly from this more traditional way of celebrating Mass to what I experienced at that high school Mass just about 10 years later? I mean, this happened so rapidly. Something had clearly gone wrong. I began serving Mass just as the Missal of Pope Paul VI, Blessed Paul VI, was coming into force. Before that, I had not paid much attention, quite honestly, to the rites associated with the Mass. But now I was observing the liturgical changes up close. And I remember as a young person being very confused by the changes that were happening. It seemed like every week there was something new happening at Mass, some new change or innovation. And then the strange and unapproved experimentation and innovations began to happen. Creativity was the rule of the day, and it seemed like anything was possible in molding the liturgy to our own personal ideas, desires, or even agendas. One of the most disturbing changes taking place was with regard to sacred music. Popular songs from the secular world began making their way into the liturgy. We could all, I'm sure, tell many horror stories of disturbing accommodations of secular music into the Mass. Now, some of you are of my generation. Do you remember the song? It was Seasons in the Sun. Remember it? You know, goodbye, Michelle, it's hard to die when all the birds are singing in the sky. That was my 8th grade graduation song at Mass. But we had to change the words, you know, goodbye, my friends, it's hard to say goodbye while all the birds are singing in the sky. We had to change something about wine and song, too. But that was the sort of thing that was happening. And if secular songs themselves did not make it into the sacred liturgy, at least the style of that music began to shape more and more the future of sacred song for the Mass. Somehow it seemed as long as the words were about God, any style of music was appropriate for the liturgy. Well, with the combination of liturgical experimentation, the decline in the quality and sacredness of music for the liturgy, and liturgical abuses, the sacred liturgy quickly drifted away from its sacred foundation. In a sense, the liturgy had been shaken from its foundation and devolved at a surprisingly rapid rate so that it no longer resembled at all the Mass as it had been celebrated and experienced for most of the Church's history. In my experience and estimation, there had been a rupture with the past. Instead of developing with a hermeneutic of continuity, as described by Pope Benedict XVI, the sacred liturgy was almost unrecognizable with what had gone before, at least as it was celebrated in much of the United States. To be sure, there were pockets of fidelity to tradition, but sadly, these were the exception. Now, to be very clear, I am not one who attributes this general rupture with tradition to the Second Vatican Council, specifically the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, Sacrosanctum Concilium. It was not the Council documents themselves that led to a disappointing liturgical reform. Those responsible for its implementation went, in my mind, well beyond what the Council Fathers had asked for. I once had a disagreement with a brother bishop, who shall go nameless, when I made this very point. He said, "But this is the Mass that the Council gave us." I disagreed strongly and pointed out that I believe, I can't verify this, but I believe most of the Council Fathers would not recognize what happened to the Mass compared to what they had voted for at the Council. We all know the story. Nowhere did the Council call for the turning around of the altar to face away from liturgical east, the direction associated with Christ and His return in glory. Nowhere did the Council call for the destruction of communion rails, for communion in the hand, for the iconoclastic remodeling of churches, and for the abolition of Latin and Gregorian chant. In fact, as we all know, the Council called for the preservation of Latin and Gregorian chant in the liturgy. Far from enjoying a pride of place in the liturgy, one seldom hears the ancient chant of the Church anymore, except in beautiful settings such as this. And certainly nowhere did the Council call for all the liturgical abuses themselves, which have plagued a good portion of the Church in the post-conciliar period. And yet all of these things were happening here in the United States during the post-conciliar period. Such was the general state of the sacred liturgy of the Church in the United States when I began my studies in engineering at a state university in Michigan. So I was a secular university student. Again, I emphasize my personal story because it is the general experience of my generation. I had attended 12 years of Catholic school education prior to starting university. But that Catholic education had occurred in the late 60s through the 1970s. Remember? And what I did not know about my Catholic faith, and especially the Holy Mass, could fill volumes. With regard to the sacred liturgy itself, I honestly had no awareness of what was really happening in the Mass. I certainly believed in the real presence, but it was not a very profound understanding. I had absolutely no idea that the Mass was essentially a sacrifice, the sacramental representation of Christ's once-for-all sacrifice on the altar of the cross. I thought of it more as a reenactment of the Last Supper, with great emphasis on the meal aspect of the Holy Eucharist. I mean, honestly, my good people, we know that the Mass is not just, a representation of Christ's sacrifice. It is essentially that. It's the essence of what the Mass is. And I hadn't a clue. Never heard it. I remember when I first learned that the Mass was really a sacrifice, I was stunned and amazed and awed. But then as a young university student, I began to read about my faith. I began to get a hold of great resources, which I studied assiduously. I began to discover what I had not been taught. I began to discover the real meaning of the holy sacrifice of the Mass. First, from my parents' old hand missals. I remember finding them and thinking, wow. And then from more scholarly articles and books, I came to realize that I had been cheated out of my Catholic heritage. Now, I want to be clear. I attribute no ill will to my earlier educators. I'm sure they were all going about what they thought was the proper and correct interpretation of the spirit of Vatican II. Nevertheless, for me, I was discovering a whole new world unknown to me, and it was exciting. As part of my journey, I discovered the traditional Latin Mass. I was deeply moved by this discovery, and soon did all I could do to learn about it. And I remember, and you've all probably seen it, that wonderful video. It was on VHS. I don't know, maybe they got it on DVD now, but it was that wonderful old black and white presentation of the Mass narrated by then the Right Reverend Monsignor Fulton J. Sheen, and scratchy and black and white and everything. But I remember watching that and just being mesmerized by it. And this was also during a period of time when I was discerning a possible call to a priestly vocation. As beautiful as I found this form of the Mass, it was for me a thing of the past. I would never experience it myself. It had been relegated to groups which had rejected the reforms of the Second Vatican Council. In my mind, it had been lost to history. And for me, I have to say, even as just a secular university student, it caused a great sadness in me. But I would simply have to accept this is the way it is and let it go. I did have two wonderful experiences as I began making preparations for study to the priesthood. One of them was the discovery of Gregorian chant. I took a music appreciation course at a secular engineering university. It was kind of like, it was kind of like, listen, for an engineering student, we have to take those dreaded humanities electives. So what do? It's like, you look for the most fun-sounding thing. I had to take one poetry class, and I remember, wow, like 8 o'clock in the morning in the dead of winter in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan when it's dark outside, and listening to my professor, who was clearly of the 60s generation, read, abstract poetry to us, was like, ugh. So I decided I'll take music appreciation. And of course, where does the history of Western music start? Gregorian chant. First time. Now, I'm probably a sophomore at least or older in college. And so for the first time in my life, I'm hearing Gregorian chant. The first time. And it was like, I was so resonating with what Father Theo said earlier. It was like it grabbed me. I had to run out and buy these big black things. They were about this big. Which I heard once some younger generation said, yeah, I found these huge black DVDs that my parents had. But I remember I found this incredible on mail order thing called the Musical Heritage Society, and I started ordering chant. And I used to lay in bed at night with my headphones on, with the lights out, and just listen to this. I didn't understand a word of it, but it did something. It touched my soul at the deepest level, and I know had a part in discernment of my priestly vocation. The other great experience I had, once I made the decision to go to the seminary, I had to do a pre-theology and philosophy at the College of St. Thomas, and I had the extreme, life-changing privilege of living for a year with the great Monsignor Richard J. Schuler at the Church of St. Agnes in St. Paul, Minnesota. And I discovered, amen, as the kids say, give it up for Monsignor Schuler. There's where I experienced traditional liturgy for the first time in my life. I joined the Gregorian Schola. In fact, we recorded the Masses of Pentecost, Christmas, and Easter. They never made it to CD. They're still on cassettes. And we chanted the propers of those Masses. So I learned chant then. That was a very formative, and it was all ordinary form, but ad orientem, Church of St. Agnes never had an altar versus populum. And beautiful, these were orchestral Masses, Beethoven, Mozart, Haydn. The most extravagant one was the Mass of St. Cecilia of Gounod, which is a little over the top for me. It's a little operatic. But anyway, that experience, I remember going to Mass at St. Agnes for the first time, and this is before I met Monsignor Schuler. I was there on vacation, and somebody told me, you got to go to this Mass, and I went. Honestly and truly, again, hope this light doesn't go on. It was a light bulb moment. Honestly, I can say, with the beauty of the ceremony, the solemnity of the movements, the vestments, the beauty of the church, this incredible music, honestly, I thought I had died and gone to heaven. I thought, this must be what heaven is like. And It had a profound effect on me, my time with the good Monsignor Schuler. God rest his soul and be good to him. I was ordained a priest, and I vowed to do all I could to celebrate the Mass well and as beautifully and reverently as I could, and according to the mind of the Church. But the sadness remained that I would never experience the usus antiquior of the Church. I even remember being a little jealous. This is when I was studying in Rome and doing my canon law studies, and there were a few priests living there who had an indult from their bishop to celebrate the traditional Mass privately. And I even remember being a little jealous of those priests I knew who could celebrate the traditional Latin Mass after St. John Paul II had allowed for the indult under the of the traditional Mass under the Indult Ecclesia Dei. So I was thinking, well, I'm still in the same place. But then Summorum Pontificum was issued by Pope Benedict XVI, and my time had come. I had been a priest for 18 years and a bishop for 2 years. I decided that since I am a bishop of the Latin Church, I should know both forms of the sacred liturgy. And groups of the faithful had asked for the extraordinary form of the Mass in my previous assignment as Bishop of Marquette. And as their chief shepherd, I felt I needed to meet their spiritual needs. In fact, I was the first to publicly celebrate the extraordinary form in my cathedral church. I wanted to send the signal that this should be an integral part of the life of the church and not something odd on the margins, but it belonged in the heart of the church. What I found as a bishop since Pope Benedict XVI issued Summorum Pontificum is that my experience is mirrored in the experience of so many people. I do not want to paint too broad of a picture, but it seems to me that there are two primary groups who have found spiritual enrichment and solace in the extraordinary form. There is, of course, an older group of faithful Catholics who grew up in the church with the traditional Latin Mass and who deeply appreciate its return. Some of these have worshipped over the years in parishes of the Society of St. Pius X, or others in an irregular canonical status. Others have simply worshipped in the ordinary form, but welcome this restored availability of tradition. But there is a very large group of younger Catholics in the United States who have discovered the extraordinary form and have been drawn strongly to it. There is certainly a group of my generation who lived before the reform of the sacred liturgy, but who have no recollection of the traditional Latin Mass. What fascinates me, however, is the large number of young Catholics, including young Catholics at this conference, who were born long after the issuance of the Missal of Paul VI, who now prefer to worship in the extraordinary form. These are people who have absolutely no experience of the traditional Latin Mass, people generally in their 20s, 30s, or 40s, but even younger here. They have discovered their Catholic heritage and they have fully embraced it. One need only observe that there are 20 chapters of the Juventutem movement established or being established in the United States and Canada. I continually run into young adult Catholics who tell me how much this form of the liturgy means to them. Some even having been drawn into the Catholic Church through the traditional liturgy. I was at this convocation of Catholic leaders in Orlando, Florida a couple weeks ago, and I can think off the top of my head of 3 young people who came up to me and shared that with me. It's just amazing to me. I was speaking to one of my elder bishops in the United States, and I have to say, a bishop for whom I have great respect and deep affection. And he was completely perplexed as to why all these young people are being drawn to the extraordinary form. He just could not understand why people who had never experienced the usus antiquior of the Latin Mass could like it or even want it to be their primary form of worship. I responded, that is precisely the question that should be asked. What is it that so many young people were not finding in their experience of the ordinary form that they were finding in the extraordinary form? I was talking to His Eminence Cardinal Burke earlier, and he made a very good point. He said, you know, it's like no one wants to acknowledge that there's something intrinsically beautiful and integral in the traditional Latin Mass in and of itself that doesn't have to be a nostalgia. It has a beauty in and of itself, in its essence, that attracts. Asking this question, what is it that people are not finding in the ordinary form, at least as they experience it? This might give us some real insight into what a new reform of the Roman liturgy might look like. In the end, the senior bishop expressed the sentiment that he wished the whole extraordinary form thing would just go away. This is not going to happen. The traditional Latin Mass has been freed from its exile, and there can be no turning back for those who have discovered this rich liturgical tradition. I couldn't say this in Germany because I don't know if they would understand the idiom, but the horse is already out of the barn. Another senior bishop I know once asked a small group of us bishops together if we thought the reform of the liturgy had been a good thing or not. You know, trying to make it a very black and white question. Was the reform of the liturgy after Vatican II good or bad? Yay, nay. In the Facebook age, you know. All of the bishops responded, of course, yes. But when it came to me, okay, I said yes also, but I said it was a heavily qualified yes. I expressed that what the Council Fathers had asked for and what they had voted for is not what happened. Once the concilium began to work on the reform of the liturgy, things began to go astray from what Sacrosanctum Concilium had actually asked for. And all you have to do is read the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy to know that to be true. Many changes were implemented that were never called for by Vatican II, as we've already pointed out. So, we ended up with a missal that many believe was not in harmony with what the Council Fathers had really voted for. And with the actual practices that arose, it soon became clear that the Mass no longer resembled the ancient liturgy of the Church. With much of the experimentation that took place, coupled with liturgical aberrations and abuses which crept in many places, there had been a rupture with tradition. In some cases, the liturgy of the Church was no longer recognizable from what had preceded the liturgical reforms implemented after Vatican II. If I can put it this way, it was as if there was a reset button hit in 1962. And it was a new beginning, sort of unhinged from what had preceded. In some isolated places, the traditional Latin Mass was still celebrated, but it was always with the granting of the indult of Ecclesia Dei, and was restricted in its celebration, always requiring the permission of the bishop for a priest to celebrate under the usus antiquior. This was certainly true here in the United States. There was the impression that the traditional Latin Mass had been forbidden, except in these indult cases. With the issuing of Summorum Pontificum by Pope Benedict XVI, the ancient form of the liturgy had been freed from its shackles. Pope Benedict clarified that the traditional Latin Mass had never been juridically abrogated, and that celebration had always been, in principle, permitted. It had not been simply relegated to be a relic of the past. One of his most powerful statements in Summorum Pontificum, and we all know this, I think, I will quote here because I think it just really says what he wanted to say. What earlier generations held as sacred remains sacred and great for us too. And it cannot be all of a sudden entirely forbidden or even considered harmful. It behooves all of us to preserve the riches which have developed in the Church's faith and prayer and to give them their proper place." Unquote. This is so true. You know, Bishop Vaja made reference to that last night. You know, when I see people mocking the traditional Latin Mass, or quite honestly, mocking you and me. There was a mocking of this liturgical conference, in fact, that went out just about a week ago in the mail. When I see that, I have to say, and as Bishop Vaja was saying last night, you know, where does this visceral, knee-jerk reaction come from? And, you know, I get a little angry. This is the liturgy that nourished the faith of my mother. And my faith comes from my mother, primarily. My father was a convert. This is the faith that nourished, or the liturgy that nourished the faith of my grandparents. My Polish grandparents, by the way. This is the liturgy that nourished the lives of the saints. You know, it struck me as I was learning the extraordinary form back in Michigan. You know, our first bishop there is the Bishop of Marquette, the Venerable Frederick Baraga. His cause is in process for canon as a beatification. I worked on his cause for many, many years. I have great devotion to Venerable Frederick Baraga. And it dawned on me as I was learning this liturgy, this is the liturgy he celebrated. And this connection was felt immediately. Pope Benedict had made it clear that his purpose in issuing Summorum Pontificum had been to achieve an interior reconciliation in the heart of the Church. Many took this to mean that what was intended was to reconcile the followers of Archbishop Lefebvre and the Society of St. Pius X and other groups similar. While this is partly true, it does not tell the whole story. What the Pope meant was that the Church herself needed this interior reconciliation, and not just those groups which had placed themselves in an irregular canonical status. All one has to do is read the full text of Summorum Pontificum and the letter of explanation which accompanied it. I have it from the mouth of the Pope Emeritus himself. During my Ad Limina visit in 2012, I asked the Holy Father about Summorum Pontificum. Actually, I thanked him for Summorum Pontificum. And he responded with vigor. It was interesting because you could see as soon as he started talking about it, he just kind of straightened up in his chair and got very leaned in. And he responded with vigor that he had issued the motu proprio in order to interiorly reconcile the Church with her past. You know, when he first started speaking, he said, you know, I issued Summorum Pontificum to reconcile. And as soon as I heard reconcile, okay, he's going to say reconcile, you know, the followers of Archbishop Lefebvre. No, to reconcile the church with her past. There could be no reform of rupture, but a reform that would employ the hermeneutic of continuity. In his recent book, The Last Testament, which is an interview with the Pope Emeritus, Pope Benedict was specifically asked if he had allowed for a greater use of the extraordinary form as primarily a concession to the Society of St. Pius X. His response is clear and very revealing. And I quote him now. And there's an exclamation point after this first sentence. This is just absolutely false. It was important for me that the church is one with herself interiorly, with her own past, that what was previously holy to her is not somehow wrong now. The right must develop. In that sense, reform is appropriate. But the continuity must not be ruptured. My intentions were not of a tactical nature. They were about the substance of the matter itself. Unquote. So with Summorum Pontificum, the landscape of the liturgy in the church has truly changed. This is certainly true here, of course, in the United States. There are many new religious communities dedicated to the extraordinary form, and they are drawing large numbers of priestly and religious vocations among young people who have been drawn to the traditional liturgy. One need only think of the priestly fraternity of St. Peter, the Institute of Christ the King, sovereign priest, both of which have a significant presence here in the United States and at this conference. They operate in several dioceses. Some religious communities also celebrate according to a very traditional expression of the ordinary form, heavily influenced by the greater presence and celebration of the extraordinary form in the country. These communities are also experiencing a large number of vocations from among the youth. There's a growing number of the faithful who are asking for the extraordinary form in almost every diocese in the United States. And I know this is true, certainly true here in the Archdiocese of Portland. It is catching on. Most bishops, including myself, are doing the best we can to respond to these needs. Challenge is to find priests who are willing and able to dedicate themselves to learning this form of the Mass, making it available to a growing number of the faithful who are asking for it. And that's why I'm of a fairly radical, and I have not fully implemented this yet. I'm of a fairly radical mind. No, I really honestly think, for those that are capable, that every seminarian, gentlemen, and every priest should learn the extraordinary form. And I say this for two reasons. Really, it would make it much easier to provide for this liturgy for those who rightfully aspire to it and desire it, if more priests were available who are capable. So that's what we're simply to meet the pastoral needs of the people, right? But also so that they will understand the history of the development of the sacred liturgy. Because I know that learning the extraordinary form will have a profound effect on how they experience and celebrate the ordinary form. This mutual enrichment that Pope Benedict speaks about. So that's an aside. I would like to emphasize again that this growing interest in the extraordinary form is not just among the faithful who remember it and have an affection or attachment to it. There is a growing number of young people and young families who are discovering it for the first time, are being drawn to it, and who are becoming serenely attached to it as a means of fulfilling a deep spiritual desire of the heart. And as we know, there's particular interest in the extraordinary form among families who homeschool their children, interestingly. An interesting thing happened recently as I was preparing to make that trip to Germany earlier this year to deliver the talk. A member of this archdiocese is part of, and I won't name people, a member of this archdiocese is part of a study group right now, and most of the members of this group are what we might call more liberal. I hate these labels, be honest with you. I really do hate these labels, but grasping for words, more liberal when it comes to many of the moral teachings and disciplines of the church. Yet this group of people unanimously were of the opinion that the church had made a big mistake in getting rid of Latin in the traditional Mass. They miss it. So maybe converts to a more traditional liturgy will even come from some surprising circles. Many seminarians in the United States are also interested in the extraordinary form. They seem to be attracted to the beauty, reverence, and prayerfulness of the usus antiquior. I also have the impression that it gives them a greater sense of priestly identity, which the extraordinary form certainly does. Many seminarians are being asked to be trained in the extraordinary form, and some newly ordained priests are actually offering their first Mass in the extraordinary form, something unthinkable. Not too long ago. To that priestly identity piece, and I remember once I got comfortable with the extraordinary form, and let me tell you, I'm self-taught, okay? Thank you, Priestly Fraternity of St. Peter, St. John Cantius Society from Chicago, and EWTN for putting in that wonderful instructional video and the books. I mean, I taught myself, and, my first private, low Mass took me an hour to celebrate. I kept having to look at the cheat card, okay, what next? But once I became really comfortable with it and familiar with it, and now I'm extremely comfortable with it, I get in my zone. And there's just something that happens in celebrating that Mass. The ritual, the gestures, the prayers, the movements, the rhythm of it. There's just like a spiritual place that it takes me to. And it's not a private devotion thing either. I don't want it to leave that impression, because that's what, as Bishop Vajra was saying, that's what so many people think this is just some sort of private devotion thing. No, this is what you in the pews experience as well. But I remember when I really finally got comfortable with it, it suddenly dawned on me once I said, wow, I really feel like a priest, There are still, unfortunately, many priests and members of the lay faithful who are strongly opposed to the extraordinary form and who do not wish to see it spread any further. And I can tell you, I've run into it. We have witnessed this, as I said, even in connection with this Sacred Liturgy Conference, sadly. I honestly do not fully understand why they feel so threatened by its presence, although Bishop Vajra's talk last night might give us some insight. One priest expressed his discomfort with my own appreciation of the extraordinary form, I think fearing somehow that I was going to somehow impose it on people. And I think that, and I know some of my wonderful priests are here today, and I've said this to them at our convocations, I think everybody is waiting for me to pull that secret liturgical plan out of my back pocket and spring it on everybody. I really don't have an agenda except the church's agenda, and I think, guys, you'd have to be honest. I've been very gentle and patient. So in response to that, I simply explained that I have to be a shepherd to all of God's people entrusted to my care. Including those who have this appreciation for this Mass, and have legitimate desires to be spiritually nourished by the ancient liturgy of the Church. It is fully legitimized by Summorum Pontificum, and I need to care for them. In fact, people who have had these traditional liturgical sensibilities have long felt marginalized and forgotten in the Church. It is time they had their proper respect and place in the body of Christ. In the end, there is no going back. The extraordinary form of the Mass is becoming more and more normalized in the life of the Church. People have drunk from the deep well of the Church's liturgical tradition and will not be satisfied with anything less. As for this interior reconciliation in the heart of the Church, which Pope Benedict XVI so desired by issuing Summorum Pontificum, there is much work to be done. In my view, it is my view, that all future liturgical reform must be measured against the ancient form of the Roman liturgy. Pope Benedict XVI spoke of a mutual enrichment of the two forms of the one Roman rite. In any future changes to the ordinary form, the ancient liturgy of the Church must once again be recognized in the way the Church celebrates the holy sacrifice of the Mass. This I think, is a very important point. You know, I think that, and I think especially for those of a younger generation who've only experienced the liturgy as it has been given to us since Vatican II, you know, you read Sacrosanctum Concilium and the documents of the Church sort of against that liturgy. That's a mistake. The liturgy, the Sacrosanctum Concilium was not reforming the Missal of Pope Blessed Paul VI. Sacrosanctum Concilium was calling for a reform of the Missal of Pius V and in its 1962 form. So, you know, the ancient liturgy needs to be the measure. You know, I find this all the time in celebrating Mass myself. If I'm not sure about how something should look, if you will, you know, where there's some freedom, how this should look now in the liturgy, I reference, okay, well, how is this done in the ancient liturgy of the Church? That should be the touchstone. Instead, you know, everybody's still into all the innovations and don't really care if the liturgy looks anything like it did in the past. There needs to be, I'm sorry, I'm one of those, even though we're not supposed to say it, I guess. I'm still one of those that believes in the reform of the reform. There needs to be a reform of the reform. And, you know, this will only come with time and patience and steadiness in the path. But I believe it will come. So may the extraordinary form continue to flourish in the Church for the greater honor and glory of God and for the salvation of souls. God bless you.
This lecture was recorded at the 2017 Sacred Liturgy Conference. For additional information, including a schedule of our upcoming events, please visit our website at sacredliturgyconference.org.